Hello, I'm Rita Campos from the Nayzilam launch mission. Today, I'll be taking you through the design of Study 1, the Nayzilam clinical trial, which is the basis for the product approval. In May 2019, Nayzilam was approved for the acute treatment of intermittent stereotypic episodes of frequent seizure activity, such as seizure clusters, acute repetitive seizures, that are distinct from a patient's usual seizure pattern in patients with epilepsy 12 years of age and older. Nayzilam was studied in a phase 3 randomized double-blind placebo-controlled trial. Patients in the trial were aged 12 or older, had an established diagnosis of partial or generalized epilepsy, were on a stable regimen of anti-epileptic drugs, and had a documented history of seizure clusters. These seizure clusters were composed of at least 2 seizures within 6 hours, which could be either partial onset or generalized in type, with an observable, stereotyped, and recognizably different pattern from their non-cluster seizures. This definition of seizure clusters is in line with the broad definition of seizure clusters you're familiar with from previous trainings. That is, acute episodes of consecutive seizures that occur in short, interictal periods that may be distinguishable from a patient's typical seizure pattern or frequency. Patients in the study were also required to have a competent adult caregiver able to recognize a seizure cluster and willing to be trained in the study procedures and to administer treatment. The study was conducted in 2 phases: an open-label test dose phase, followed by a double-blind, placebo-controlled comparative phase. The test dose phase occurred in clinic under HCP supervision, while the patient was not having a seizure. In the test dose phase, tolerability was assessed in 292 patients who received 2 5-milligram doses of Nayzilam, separated by 10 minutes, for a total dose of 10 milligrams. So you might be wondering why a test dose phase was included. Well, drug products containing midazolam, including Nayzilam, have a central nervous system depressant effect. Serious cardiorespiratory adverse reactions, including respiratory depression, have occurred after administration of midazolam. As Nayzilam would be given by a caregiver in the outpatient setting, where emergency diagnosis and intervention for respiratory depression would not be immediately available, an in-clinic test dose phase was required before patients could progress to the comparative phase of the study. After the test dose phase, 262 patients were randomized 2-to-1, and 201 patients received double-blind treatment in the comparative phase, which is where we will now focus. In order to understand how and why treatment was administered, we must first level set on the goals of treatment. Treatment success was the primary endpoint defined by 2 components. First, determination of seizures within 10 minutes after the double-blind dose was given, which measured if the immediate seizure had been stopped. And second, no recurrence of seizures between 10 minutes and 6 hours, which showed the cluster, not just the seizure, had been stopped. Treatment success was defined by 2 components because, for seizure clusters, the treatment needs to be able to stop the initial seizure, as well as stop the recurrence of the seizures that would typically occur during that cluster. To meet the treatment success endpoint, a patient had to meet both of these criteria. In the double-blind phase of the trial, each patient was treated for a single seizure cluster episode and received either a single 5-milligram dose of Nayzilam or placebo. If the seizure cluster did not terminate within 10 minutes, or if there was a recurrence of seizures within 6 hours, patients could then receive an open-label dose of Nayzilam. This means that in this open-label phase of the trial, patients in the Nayzilam arm received a second 5-milligram dose, and patients in the placebo arm received their first 5-milligram dose of Nayzilam. In terms of the baseline characteristics of the patients in the clinical trial, demographics and disease characteristics were similar in both treatment arms. For the patients in the Nayzilam arm, select baseline characteristics included a median age of 32 years and a typical baseline seizure cluster consisting of a median of 5 seizures and lasting for just over an hour. all patients were on a stable anti-epileptic drug regimen. Now, before we discuss the results, let's review the definition of the primary endpoint treatment success one more time. The primary endpoint was designed to measure both components of treatment success. If the immediate seizure had been stopped, determined by the termination of seizures within 10 minutes after the double-blind dose, and if the cluster, not just the seizure, had been stopped, determined by no recurrence of seizures within 10 minutes and 6 hours. For the first component of treatment success, as seen in the figure, 81% of Nayzilam patients experienced seizure cluster termination within 10 minutes, compared with 70% of placebo patients, showing a numerical difference in favor of Nayzilam. This component gives us information on stopping the first seizure of the seizure emergency, and it's very important to prescribing physicians to have this information. The placebo rate of 70%, which may seem high, can be explained as generally many seizures may be self-limiting and last no more than a few minutes. Therefore, the first seizure in a cluster may terminate before 10 minutes, even in placebo-treated patients. This is why the second component of treatment success must also be considered. 58% of Nayzilam patients went on to have no seizure recurrence after 10 minutes and up to 6 hours, versus 37% of the placebo group, giving us the information on the termination of the seizure clusters. Remember, for a patient to meet the primary endpoint of treatment success, they had to meet both requirements: termination of seizures within 10 minutes after the double-blind dose, and no seizure recurrence within 10 minutes and 6 hours. When accounting for both components of the primary endpoint, the percentage of patients achieving treatment success with a single dose of Nayzilam was 54% versus 34% in the placebo group, for a statistically significant difference. Additionally, the study also evaluated the occurrence and time to next seizure after the initial blinded dose of study drug. Based on a Kaplan-Meier analysis, Nayzilam-treated patients had a greater probability of not experiencing more seizures for 24 hours post-dose. It is important to note that this is probability data, and it does not mean that there is a protective or preventive aspect to Nayzilam treatment and should not be verbalized as such. During the trial, caregivers also recorded actual seizure recurrence within 24 hours post-dose, with 37% of Nayzilam-treated patients experiencing a next seizure within 24 hours after the double-blind study drug administration, versus 46% in the placebo group. Nayzilam-treated patients experienced a statistically longer time to next seizure than the placebo group. During the study, time to return to full baseline functionality after study drug administration was also evaluated. For all seizure clusters treated with Nayzilam, the median time to return to full baseline functionality after trial drug administration was approximately 90 minutes, which was comparable to placebo. Functionality was assessed and determined by the caregiver and defined as the patient's ability to return to the activity they were doing prior to the start of the seizure cluster. A significantly greater proportion of patients treated with Nayzilam returned to full baseline functionality within 24 hours of study drug administration compared with those treated with placebo. Up until now, we've focused on treatment success after only the double-blind initial dose of Nayzilam or placebo. That's because the primary endpoint of treatment success is based on a single dose during the double-blind phase. But remember, in the open-label phase of the trial, patients in the Nayzilam arm could receive a second 5 mg dose if needed, and patients in the placebo arm could receive their first 5 mg dose of Nayzilam. Approximately 31% of Nayzilam patients required an open-label dose, compared to approximately 61% of patients in the placebo-treated group. Therefore, we also have data on treatment success at any dose of Nayzilam, which we will now review. 70%, or 122 out of 175 patients, experienced overall treatment success with any dose of Nayzilam, either 1 or 2 doses. This includes the patients who were given only Nayzilam as first dose, the patients who took Nayzilam as a first dose and still needed a second one, and the patients who took placebo as a first dose and still needed an active dose of Nayzilam. If you were paying close attention, you may have noticed earlier that 43 Nayzilam-treated patients entered the open-label arm of the study. But the screen here shows 42 patients. That's because one patient received a second dose after the 6-hour time frame, and therefore that patient was not included. Let's look at some of the adverse events that occurred in the trial. In this table, which corresponds to the one found in the prescribing information, we see adverse reactions that occurred within 2 days of Nayzilam administration and were reported in at least 2% of patients receiving any dose of Nayzilam, and at a higher rate than placebo in the comparative phase. Now, I know this table might look a bit daunting, but it simply breaks down the incidence of adverse events based on which treatment patients actually received. Either placebo only, Nayzilam only, placebo plus Nayzilam, or 2 doses of Nayzilam. In the far right column, you can see an aggregate incidence of these adverse events for patients who received any dose of Nayzilam. Overall, Nayzilam was well tolerated and most adverse reactions were mild to moderate in intensity. No patients discontinued during the comparative phase. And while the table references the 2% adverse event incidence, please note that most common adverse events reported at least 5% of the Nayzilam-treated group were somnolence, headache, nasal discomfort, throat irritation, and rhinorrhea. Respiratory depression was observed with the administration of Nayzilam during clinical trials, with at least one adverse event related to acute central respiratory depression being reported in 10 patients, or 3.4%, during the test dose phase. Cardiac or respiratory arrest caused by Nayzilam was not reported during clinical trials. Now let's review some additional important safety information for Nayzilam. Please remember that Nayzilam has a boxed warning for risks from concomitant use with opioids. Concomitant use of benzodiazepines and opioids may result in profound sedation, respiratory depression, coma, and death. Reserve concomitant prescribing of these drugs for use in patients for whom alternative treatment options are inadequate. Limit dosages and duration to the minimum required. Follow patients for signs and symptoms of respiratory depression and sedation. For additional Nayzilam safety information, please refer to the important safety information currently on your screen. Thank you for your time today.